Hello, everybody. Welcome to Iron Culture presented by Mass. This is me, Eric Trexler. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms. And this is going to be an interesting episode because this is me trying to remember all the buttons. And folks who were in the chat early saw me give us a sneaky extra minute. The clock was just winding down to like 8 or 9 seconds. And I said, let's bump that up to a minute and get our ducks in a row here. So, folks, thank you for joining us if you're in the live chat. It's been a few weeks since we've gone live. We've done a bunch of pre-recorded episodes, and apparently it takes me exactly 3 weeks to forget how to do every single element of this live hosting stuff. But anyway, we are here. We have a great episode lined up for you. Dr. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
Oh, I can't complain. I'm doing good, and I'm the same. Like, I'm not sure I know how to react and engage with our live studio audience after we had our four-person whole mass crew in Austin, after we had the awesome interview with Maddie, WNBF 2024 World Champ, among other various titles. Also, our awesome one with Kaylee and Dr. Washmuth. Yeah, I feel like we haven't done our thing in a while, so I am both uncomfortable, awkward, but also really excited to be here with you. It feels like we're dating.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because in the interim, we have launched the official sister or brother podcast, also presented by Mass. The sister podcast is known as Front Page Fitness, and I host that with Lauren Colenso-Semple. And the reason that's relevant is because in the last few weeks, I've recorded like 5 episodes with Lauren and essentially nothing with you. So our rapport, our friendship has essentially collapsed. And it's been swiftly, that vacuum opened up, Lauren filled it. And so now we have rapport, we have a cadence about our interactions, all of the kind of flow of conversation. And when I'm talking to you, I feel like I'm talking to a brick wall now. I mean, I'm getting nothing back. It's very choppy. It's very uncomfortable. So hopefully within the next hour, we can try to rescue some of that chemistry we used to have, rekindle the flame, as they say.
I like how that description of our relationship and your relationship with Lauren was basically like the Cold War. There was a power vacuum, a new regime change came in, an iron wall went up, and now we're trying to break that wall down and hopefully usher in an era of peace, which, as everyone knows who's a student of history, since the Berlin Wall came down, it has been a utopia in the world. So
Yeah.
I neither one of us can keep a straight face on that. So my hope is that we can replicate that same historical monumental time moving forward from there.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to give people a chance to kind of fill into the live chat here because what we did was very sneaky. We did 3 weeks of pre-recorded episodes and then didn't tell anyone that we were going live tonight. So people are going to have a pleasant surprise when they open up YouTube tonight. But in the interim, Iron Culture is presented by the Mass Research Review, and Helms, we normally don't do this. This is very early for a sneak peek, but the 12th of the month is usually about the time we're wrapping up our articles. And honestly, Helms, I think we have an absolute doozy of an issue coming up. So folks, if you like what you're about to hear and we have piqued your interest, make sure you subscribe to the Mass Research Review. If you haven't already, make sure you do that by June 1st, because that's when this new issue is going to go out. And honestly, who are we kidding? It's going to go out a day before June 1st because our company officially, as a permanent stance, is paranoid and extremely terrified of ever being accused of releasing an issue late. So we almost always release them like 23 hours early. So all that is to say, May, how many days are in May? 30-ish, 31, something like that. Make sure you get in around the end of May, and you'll be here for the first of June, which is when this officially, that's the official release date of this new issue. Now, Helms, I've got a triple whammy coming for mass readers. I've got an article about there's a new study about using cold in theory as a strategy to facilitate fat loss. And the idea is a long-held idea, especially among the kind of more biohacker types. Not as a pejorative. There's just folks out there who are interesting and pulling all the knobs and levers and seeing what they can do. But there's long been an idea that If you increase your cold exposure, it's going to increase energy expenditure, maybe by a little bit of activation of some brown adipose tissue as the main mechanism. And you'll be burning these calories without doing any extra work. And maybe you can do that with a room that's actually not all that uncomfortable. You know, maybe it's just slightly cold, and maybe you don't replace those calories with extra eating. And boom, easy fat loss. What could be better? So I have an article about that, and in that article, I don't want to give everything away, but I make some very bold claims about why I'm ditching all the optimism about cold exposure, and I'm all in on heat. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I've also got an article about testosterone and muscle mass within the physiological range. How much does it actually matter? If you're one of those people who were just born with testosterone on the lower end of the spectrum or the higher end of the spectrum, how much does that actually matter in real terms? And what do we make of all the new chatter, all the kind of, there's been an uptick in chatter about TRT, right? And TRT is really interesting. We get a ton of questions about it in the after hours chat, which is a little bit more anonymous. I think some people are a little afraid to, venture out into those waters in the live chat. But anyway, a lot of questions because, there's a lot of clinics popping up left and right. Back in the day, Helms, we're old. Back in the day, I had heard rumblings that if you go down to Miami, Florida, there were these longevity
Age
or
clinics,
anti-aging clinics. And basically you walk up there, they would always be in affluent areas with a lot of retirees that are also near a beach. That was exclusively where they were. And you could walk up and there'd be a doctor who maybe had his license pulled and then restored 3 times and was yeah, you want human growth hormone, you want testosterone, I gotcha. But nowadays, of course, there's been a proliferation of kind of online pharmaceutical delivery services that do telehealth with it. I think that was kind of almost, I could be totally butchering the timeline, but it seems like after COVID, people really started to proliferate some of the, hey, hop on a Zoom call with a medical professional, we'll ship you some prescriptions and we're all good here. And of course, there's pros and cons to that. It's generally good for people who need medication to have more access to the medication they need. However, there's also maybe some vulnerabilities that pop up when people are hey, hop on a Zoom call with me, let me know what you want. And it's just, hey, bring your grocery list of pharmaceuticals and I'll send them your way. So all that is to say, Helms, there used to be the whole natty or not kind of thing. There was a whole genre of social media content. That stuff's gotten even murkier because now it's natty or explicitly, obscenely not natty or TRT-ish semi-natty. And so I kind of dig into what is TRT? What are people actually doing? And here's why, basically, if you're trying to do some kind of witch hunt to tell what kind of people are actually on real TRT, it will not work by design. You should not be able to tell if a person's on TRT or not unless you have unless you've been giving them questionnaires every week about how they're feeling in terms of their libido and their energy level and things like that. So I get into what we can expect about fluctuations in testosterone in the physiological range, and I try to clear up a whole bunch of nonsense about all this new TRT stuff. And then finally, Helms, how could I forget? My final article of the month is a big update on fat. And fat is always a fan favorite. There's always a ton of chatter online about dietary fat because honestly, let's call it what it is. Right now, in the kind of alternative nutrition space, fat is where it's at in terms of the most exciting content and, the kind of parallel theories that are butting up against conventional wisdom in nutrition. So one of those things that's kind of breaking out into this has been wild to see, Helms. I'm sure you've been really enjoying this as much as I have. All the stuff about seed oils used to be siloed away in this ultra nerd, way too in the weeds, evidence-based nutrition or biohackery nutrition. This was for people who spent way too much time chronically online talking about nutrition, ourselves included. But that is in America breaking out into mainstream. Like you'll turn on the news and you'll hear like people talking about what's new at the White House. Oh, everybody's talking about seed oils and food dyes. And so I have a big update on seed oils, a new paper that came down the pike. And then also, this was like a 2-for-1 mass article, which we really rarely do. But I reviewed 2 articles in the same, or 2 studies in the same mass article. And the other one was about Helms, lean mass hyperresponders.
Yep.
Now, Helms, I think you and I could do, man, probably a whole Iron Culture episode just nitpicking that term. I think that is the most egregiously misnamed term in the history of health and physiology. Lean mass hyperresponder can only mean, in my headcanon and my personal dictionary, a lean mass hyperresponder can only be a person who grows a lot when they lift weights, period. Right? And
or just in general.
Or just in general. Yeah, just someone who has a lot of muscle and we don't know why. But anyway, lean mass hyperresponder is, I'll be candid, I'll be more brazen with my words than I usually am. It's a term that was whipped up to describe a beautiful fairy tale of people who have extremely high LDL and ApoB levels, but because they don't have obesity, we're going to pretend that's fine. And that's, honestly, am I strawmanning it? Yes. By a lot? Not really. So the idea is there's these people who are lean, they're on ketogenic diets, their LDL's like 250. You want to keep it under 100. But the idea is like, well, but their triglycerides are low and their HDL is a little high. So like, what if this is just fine? So there's a new paper that came out basically feeding into some narratives about lean mass hyperresponders. And Helms, my pitch to kind of pique interest is that this publication, start to finish, was a disaster. It was a mess. And even I, as someone who loves to get in the weeds of just botched execution of research and nonsense in terms of science communication, there were new things for me in this whole saga, things that you don't see often. So I personally had a really good time writing that article.
I can't wait to see the statistical analysis, which I think should be done. And maybe this can be our next collaboration, Trex, upon polling people classified as lean mass hyperresponders to see the overlap or the correlation with people who listen to carnivore podcasts and are intimately familiar with, say, Paul Saladino's content. Because I think there would probably be a very high correlation. Because that's essentially what the question is are you someone who somehow has incorporated your vision of masculinity and fitness as well as eating plants or meat all into the same category? Do those somehow need to be connected for you? And I think the answer would be yes.
Yeah, no, I bet like you could create a perfect prediction algorithm to determine who fits the criteria for a lean mass hyperresponder. And it's going to be like 4% predicted by like if you have just familial genetic high cholesterol, dyslipidemia that runs in the family, but you also happen to be an exercise buff. And then the other 96% is going to be exactly what you said. It's just like, and yeah, 100%. It's such a strange little phenomenon, but I will say this. I'm glad that research was done on the topic. And I'm also tickled that it went exactly how you would think. And that's my teaser. Helms, I've been blabbering away. What do you have on the docket for this upcoming issue?
I got a doubleheader, and as you know, I can sticking with baseball analogies that I'm completely unqualified to even attempt. I can also switch hit. So we've got both a nutrition and a training topic. One of them is definitely old man yelling at the clouds because I have had a bee in my proverbial bonnet. I guess it'd be a proverbial bee as well, because I have neither a bee nor a bonnet. But we'll just say I've got a bee in my bonnet for this new narrative that's popped up that eccentric training, depending upon what I've heard online, is anything from not quite as good as the causes a little more muscle damage, and people hyping up doing slow eccentrics or pauses in that stretch position. Maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be, which is a reasonable but arguably difficult to defend position, all the way to the more common, unfortunate version of this narrative, which is that the eccentric is trash, does not stimulate muscle growth at all, and only generates fatigue, and that the concentric is where it's at because of various throwaway mechanisms that when I engage with people, they don't seem to be able to continually defend, related to motor unit recruitment, the Titan molecule, and some other hand wavy things. And this is actually, the study I'm reviewing is a recent one by Nakamura and colleagues, where it's really simple. I love how easy the study design was. They grabbed a bunch of sedentary young men and they said, hey, we're going to ultrasound your calves pre-post. We're going to do isometric strength testing. And all I want you to do is either be in a control group, so nothing, or we're going to then put you in a within subject design. So each one of your limbs is doing something different. Get on that box, give me a nice calf raise with both feet, and then lift one of them up and lower it. And we're just going to randomize which one of your two limbs gets assigned to get the eccentric. So they can compare to concentric eccentric group that had, concentric on the way up, or limb, I should say, and then eccentric on the way down, to then comparing the limb that only got the bilateral concentric. Now, I would normally never review this study in mass. If we rewind the clock 6 months ago before this narrative pops up, I tell you, hey, we compared lifting your whole body with both limbs, just body weight, and then we compared that to then also getting to do the eccentric with additional load, so essentially an eccentric overload, and we progress volume over time in these sedentary, untrained individuals. Who do you think grows more and gets stronger? And you're like, oh, so how do they match volume and load? Oh, they didn't. It's higher loads on the eccentric, and they get an eccentric, so arguably twice the volume, and higher load on the eccentric, plus the concentric, versus just the concentric. It's like, oh, what are they trying to show here? That the eccentric makes you grow muscle. Well, we already knew that. Yeah, why would I review this? But then, here we are, where we have essentially, here the claim. The claim is anywhere from the eccentric is not as good to it does nothing to it's actively harmful to the process of hypertrophy. So this is a hypothesis, would be, you could reasonably state based upon encountering some of these narratives in the wild, that you'd actually expect the concentric only group, especially these untrained individuals, to grow more. Shocker of all shockers, that's not what happened.
Wow.
And really, this is just the Trojan horse. This paper by Nakamura, Trex, it's not what I really want to talk about.
Yeah.
The article that I'm writing, I introduced that. But what I'm really talking about
you have an axe to grind, and you're going to grind it.
Dude, by the time I'm done with it, it's a handle.
Yeah.
It's a handle. And I even started getting some of that wood down. It's basically
you got your knuckles in the mix, too. Yeah.
That's right. I'm bloody knuckles holding some splinters that I'm going to stab you with until you're like, okay, I get it. The eccentric's important, Eric. But it's actually a Trojan horse for two topics. One is, here's 40 years of research on the eccentric. There was a meta-analysis published back in January in the JSCR, which I think is indicative of the general finding, shocker of all shockers, that the eccentric seems to be, with the most conservative interpretation, we're talking P equals 0.051 for the overall meta-analysis effect, with, I think, a effect size that just barely didn't hit moderate. It was like 0.47 and 0.051. So technically we can say, like, they roughly do the same, but it's neutral to positive, and some of the sub-analyses clearly show that in certain circumstances, which I'll talk about in the article as to why, the eccentric, when they're compared head-to-head in various ways with the concentric, might even stimulate more hypertrophy.
Can I make a meta-commentary very briefly? Or no, you had a second part. Please, go on.
Yeah, the main thing, so the Trojan horse, it's got, this is just what's in the limbs, but what's in the main trunk of that horse is actually a discussion of the philosophy of science that underpins sports science. How do we? Because the reason is that a lot of, I'll be honest, I'll be very, very candid here. This is one of a series of proposed quote unquote models as to the way hypertrophy works and therefore how we should train. And to give due credit to where I think these models are generating from, I don't think this is a abuse of science or a use of science to try to self-promote or make money. I do think these are genuine, interested hypotheses as to how hypertrophy works, and then therefore what does that mean for training. And the concerning thing is that the way you address the pseudoscience charlatan is you go, okay, listen, you either don't understand the science, but you're happy just to go out on a limb and try to sell something, or you don't care that you don't understand the science or that you're misrepresenting it because you're going to go out on a limb and try to sell something or promote yourself. That's not new. That is as old as the game, right? What is a little more concerning is when someone is either selectively engaging with the science and either has a disregard or a complete ignorance to the underlying philosophy of how do we know what we know. So I think to address this, what I actually have to do, what I'm going to do in this article, is go, listen, someone has proposed a model or a hypothesis. There's actually something that's been discussed about how we verify those things. Karl Popper, the notion of falsification, the demarcation problem that's been debated for centuries of what is the line between science and pseudoscience. And while that's still being debated, and I don't think necessarily a realist and a constructionist are ever going to totally agree because they have a fundamental different understanding of what we can know in the world, at least in the realm of people who go, right, I think empirical research and science is helpful. We've made some pretty firm decisions about how do we decide if something is a thing. And you can, ironically, be science interested and selectively use science to create a model, which I'm going to generously just call a hypothesis, and then amazingly, just ignore the fact that science easily refutes the model you just created based upon science if you decide to disregard the underlying philosophy of science in this way. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the article, so that hopefully someone reads this, and the next time something comes around like this, that sounds science-based but is immediately and easily refuted by it. If you were, you could talk to ChatGPT, you can ask your friend who's getting a bachelor's degree, you could just Google it for a second, you can jump on Google Scholar. I mean, you have to be matrix dodging these bullets to not know that this is not actually in step with the data comparing concentric to eccentric. So that's what the article's about. What did you have to say, Trace?
Well, I just wanted to make a meta comment, which is a lot of times people ask, Helms, if you had a dime for every time you've been asked this, you'd probably retire, pack it up, and go move to the beach. But people ask all the time, should I get a degree in exercise science? What is the value of formal education versus just me having a lot of fun being self-educated and self-taught and kind of working my way through it on my own? And what I usually tell people is self-education is a beautiful thing. It's a sign of passion and interest to want to explore something and dig into it. And there are a great many people who, as long as they're learning from reputable sources, will do very well with self-education. But the value of a formal education of any level, you don't have to go get a PhD in something, but what's nice about formal education is every now and then, especially if you are enthusiastic and passionate about the topic, you will find yourself way over your skis, and you will be hurtling toward a terrible idea gleefully and with enthusiasm, completely certain that you're correct. And the role of formal education is to sternly smack your wrist with a ruler and say, you're off base here. Your fundamentals are wrong. You're missing 40 years of literature that I spent my life reading because I'm a 70-year-old professor. So it's not to say hey, we want to gatekeep and make sure that there's no disruptors who rock the boat and challenge pre-existing hypotheses. But when you do seek out formal education or education from people with formal education, there are those guardrails of saying well, let's root this in theory. Let's not flip over the table and pretend we know nothing. Let's build upon the things we do know, treating them with a proper level of confidence relative to the evidence. And so, if you were to walk up in an undergraduate exercise science course and tell the professor, I think eccentrics are useless or even fundamentally detrimental to hypertrophy, they'd say, I've never been more sure that you're wrong. And I love that you're thinking about these topics that we're not covering in the lectures, but I will show you, 40, like you said, Helms, 40 years of research indicating why you should probably let that one go and shift your efforts towards something a little bit more, a little bit more productive and conducive to your learning. But that's one of the problems I often see with a select number of folks who take a purely self-educated route and decide they want to transition from self-educating to educator, and they start kind of building their own theories. And what you find is that a lot of times those theories critically are lacking in the fundamentals, and it's just stepping on a rake that you don't need to step on. Like, you could just start with a basic textbook and save yourself the trouble of trying to custom individually learn everything that could be learned in the field.
Absolutely. And I think in many ways, the interesting thing is how this gets constructed, where there is a search for a first principles understanding of muscle physiology, and then a willingness, perhaps due to the desire to have it all figured out, of filling in the gaps we don't yet know with logical assumptions that have been proposed but have not been empirically tested, creating a cohesive model, and then going, therefore, training works like this. But then you find yourself in the strange position where when you then propose, well, we've got it figured out, and based upon this understanding of this model, the eccentric is actually harming things and just causing damage without any stimulus. The response of someone who's read the research is, well, then why does the data repeatedly and continually show that the eccentric and concentric are at least producing similar, if not greater, in the eccentric condition, hypertrophy? And the person goes, well, that can't be true because motor unit recruitment's higher during the concentric and the mechanosensors are better stimulated by the concentric. And the person goes, well, that can't be true because we have 40 years of research showing that that's just not what happens.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole philosophy of science comes in.
Yeah.
Because you have to find a way to reconcile that. And hint, hint, perhaps when you generate a hypothesis or a model, you should have some way of testing its veracity so that we're not actually going back to what the Greeks used to do and just philosophize and then go back to drinking from the aqueduct and getting lead poisoning and going, you know what, it's probably something wrong with my four humors that need to be balanced. Why don't you bleed me, and then, we'll deal with the bile acids and we'll be good. Thanks, Socrates. We've got it all figured out.
I hear you, man. All right, well, I'm sure people are going to be...
Oh, hold on. I've got a second article.
Yes, I was going to say, I'm sure people are chomping at the bit to read that one, but what's the other one?
The other one, I think you'll actually be interested in seeing this one because you've done a lot of the work on time-restricted feeding in mass over the last few years. A recent article came out by Blake and colleagues on hypercaloric 16-8, your traditional Martin Birkenstyle-esque 16-8, 8 hours feeding window, but for a hypertrophy-oriented protocol. So trying to gain weight rather than just kind of recomp or lose weight or see if you can mitigate lean mass losses or even gain a little bit of lean mass while you're in a slight deficit, which is most of the time-restricted feeding research. And there's some heavy hitters on this one. You got Grant Tinsley on the list, who's done a lot of work in this area. You got Andy Galpin, who's on this one. And there's also notable internet-famous science people as well, like, not that Andy isn't, but Menno Henselman's on there. So it should be an interesting take, and I'm looking forward to it because the vast majority of work on time-restricted feeding has either been an unintentional deficit or an explicit deficit. So yeah, it'd be cool to see.
All right, man. Sounds great. Well, I tell you what, we have turned this into a full-on infomercial for the Mass Research Review. So what do you say that we dive in to some questions here? I'm ready. We had a couple questions about this, Helms. I'm pretty sure that we've talked about this before, but it always bears repeating. I know nothing about this, but we always get a lot of questions about extra skin. So people who lose weight and they're like, hey, I lost a substantial amount of weight, but I have some extra skin. I'd like it to go away. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. What kind of guidance do you have in terms of like what is the likelihood that some of that looser extra skin will kind of tighten up or go away? And is there perhaps, this is me kind of elaborating on the question, is there maybe kind of a, I wouldn't ask you to give an exact number, but a threshold maybe where it seems like, just in my personal experience, it seems like people who maybe they lose 200 pounds, it definitely seems to be a lot more noticeable than maybe someone who does your typical bodybuilding, gain 40 pounds, lose 40 pounds back and forth. So what do you know about the possibility of kind of shrinking that skin down or losing some of that extra skin?
Sure. This is going to come almost exclusively from my knowledge of having coached a whole bunch of people over the years, working with people who have gotten very, very lean. So they've lost body fat past the point where people typically are. And you can really just see what is skin and not subcutaneous fat, at least to any meaningful degree. And there seems to be three factors. One, which you already discussed, how much weight was lost. Two, individual factors, which I just don't know about, skin elasticity and plasticity, I guess you could say. And then three, potentially age. So a good example of someone who has almost no visible loose skin, who lost a substantial amount of weight, would be Alberto Nunez. He, in his, the glory days, and we've talked about these, where the messaging was, if you need to get huge, and you've done this, get a extra large pizza, dump olive oil on it, and eat it until you just don't throw up. That's the limit, right?
Yeah.
And rinse and repeat 5 times a day. So he got up to a evening clothed weigh-in of 250, which of course is very valid.
No way. How tall is
did.
Berto?
Berto is 5'9.5".
Oh my God, that's crazy.
Yes, and his stage weight is in the low 160s. And by the way, it was not in the low 160s at the beginning of his career. It was in the mid 150s.
And I should say, my reaction is just because I know him to be a 160-ish pound lean man. It's not like it's not a jarring thing to hear that someone of that height is 250 pounds. But just Berto, I had no idea that he had ever gotten that high.
Yeah. So if we compare depleted, nude, lowest weigh-in during your first contest prep where you over-dieted to your totally full, spilled over, peak off-season wearing sweatpants in the gym, there's almost a 100-pound swing. Realistically, we're talking about, as far as actual body fat differences, maybe 70 pounds.
Yeah.
Like if we talk about just the lean body mass that may not even be muscle that's just associated with carrying that much tissue. And there's really no visible skin, and he's one of the leanest looking bodybuilders out there. And he has just really thin, healthy skin that seems to bounce back and be quite elastic. Granted, a lot of this was done when he was younger.
Yeah.
So that all occurred in his early 20s. So I think you can see a couple of factors there at play. He did this once, never got that heavy again. I don't think his off seasons ever took him over 200 after that. I could be wrong. So he got away with that. I have seen other people who have not gotten away with that, even though similar time frame between cutting and bulking, as well as age and amount of weight lost. So there are obviously some genetic factors. I know you were pretty heavy before and in between some of your preps, and I haven't seen a tremendous number of contest prep pictures of you, but you don't seem to have any loose skin when you diet down.
No, the only thing I kind of question about that whole dreamer bulking saga that I embarked on is I feel like once I got that heavy and carried that much fat, it seemed like my kind of natural comfortable body fat level that I just kind of gravitate to if I'm not thinking about it did rise a little bit. It seemed like it made it harder to kind of maintain a lean physique kind of year round, which is why I that's not why I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it because it doesn't seem to be useful in the literature. But yeah, so I haven't had any extra skin throughout my career, but I do sometimes wonder if I made life just a little bit harder by carrying all that weight for an extended period of time.
Yeah, and obviously it's not insurmountable if you look at the kind of off-season condition that someone like, Berto carries. If that becomes the thing you focus on, behavior is probably a bigger role, but nonetheless, you and him are good examples of people who got pretty heavy and then get pretty light for stage condition and didn't retain a fair bit. But I have literally seen people with less numbers than both of you who have had a little bit of loose skin. The times where it seems to be detrimental are when we're talking three-digit numbers or higher, in terms of just the amount of skin that seems to come afterwards. There's some things you can do with posing that helps if it's a relatively minor, how you expand certain shots, the angle you take. I've worked around it in people. I've seen much smaller amounts of weight loss in pretty lean people who've never been overweight also result in some of that kind of loose skin in competitors who are in their 50s. We're talking someone who is getting down to like 175 in kind of stage condition, and they only got up to about 100.
Yeah.
So like a little over 200 pounds.
Yeah.
Like a 30-pound swing, 40-pound swing. If you do that in your 50s, there's a much higher probability that you might have some loose skin. So I think it definitely makes sense, and there's probably an argument from a health perspective, typically how long you've been training at that point, and also from a depending upon how old you are, how much over 50 you are. If you're in your 60s, can you even generate the same kind of anabolic stimulus when you got some age-related factors, which are overblown but still exist, working against you? And I would say that you probably really don't want to do any type of dreamer bulk when you're in that stage.
Yeah.
But yeah, the general recommendation I would just have is probably speak to a dermatologist about it, speak to a surgeon, someone who really does know what needs to be done. But I'm not aware of any ways, if you have a substantial amount of visible loose skin, it's only going to tighten up so much.
Yeah.
From what I've seen.
Yeah. It seems like the only thing I've heard of that really works is surgery, unfortunately, for that. But again, like you said, talk to a dermatologist. They may be able to help out. What's really interesting to me is I feel like I didn't get enough education about skin. It might sound like a weird thing to say, but I feel like all the physiology coursework that I took was very light on skin education. And most of the folks I talk to, of course I talk about like everybody behind their back. It's like my favorite thing to do. But most of the people I talk to who have done serious coursework in physiology, no one knows anything about skin. And I have to believe that someone out there has figured out how skin works, but it doesn't seem to be really emphasized in a lot of the teaching. I mean, maybe if you get into maybe if you're doing like a surgical route, getting deeper into med school, obviously you got to learn about wound care. You got to learn about making incisions and stuff. But yeah, just your kind of, bachelor's and master's level physiology courses, they're just frankly bigger fish to fry in terms of what they like to teach.
They don't even go skin deep on skin.
They really don't. Yeah. So I always just feel totally ill-equipped when people ask me questions about skin, because I'm like, I know you definitely want to have it and you want it to be approximately continuous. You don't want any large holes in it. But that's about as much as you learn as an exercise scientist about skin. You learn obviously a little bit about sweating, but yeah, that's pretty much it.
I did go down a rabbit hole trying to figure out what is about masters competitors of why they look to have muscle maturity, which is definitely an anecdote.
Yeah.
Muscle maturity, for those who don't know, in the competitive bodybuilding world, is there seems to be this belief that there is a quality of competitors who are in their 30s or 40s or 50s who've just been lifting for a long time that people will describe as independent from leanness or muscle mass, where you can be as big, you can be as shredded, you can both have glute striations, but they just have this harder, more detailed, more dense look. Is what it's described as. Grainy look, exactly. Now the thing is, you can sometimes see this in younger competitors. It's certainly not
Don't kill the myth.
I know.
Let us have it.
But what I was interested in was what might be causing this, and one of the things that I hypothesized was the actual thickness of the skin itself, not the subcutaneous layer of skin, because I think there's something to it. There is these two, what I think would probably be competing processes or changes in skin that you can find data on. Is you start to lose the elasticity. There are changes in the actual proteins and their quantity and quality that make up skin as you get older. and there's also just a thinning of the skin as you get older. And my prediction is that somewhere before you're really old, but sometime after you're relatively young, there's this peak combination, especially if you haven't gotten really heavy and have excess skin, to where your skin is thinner but reasonably elastic, so that it still stretches over muscles nicely. Because I can see in some like M3, M4 competitors in their 60s, like there'll be certain spots where it looks really good, like on their arm, where they've never really gotten that heavy, still looks tight. But then like you can tell their skin is thin, but a little droopy, like right around their waist
Yeah.
or on their lower pec. But man, when they're in their 40s and their 50s, they seem to look leaner in areas where they are lean already.
Yeah.
And I think that might be a little bit of what muscle maturity is. I have definitely noticed just in my early 40s, there's a little more detail in some spots than there used to be, and I don't think I'm any bigger. So,
Did you switch from
yeah.
chicken to fish?
Well, yeah, I'm actually, the pescatarian thing does co-vary with that, so
Yeah.
that could be it as well.
Yeah.
But I did actually look into research on this. There is research showing that your skin literally does get thinner as you get older.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's one of those things you don't have to work too hard to convince someone your skin changes as you age, right? Like that's a pretty common thing. All right, Helms, we got to go
Yes,
rapid
sir.
fire here because we've been jabbering and we need to give the people quality. We need to give them what they want. So,
Let's do it.
quick question for you here. I don't know if you're going to be able to restrain yourself, but we got a question about fat loading in terms of peak week for bodybuilding. And whether or not you think there might be utility for fat loading as part of a peak week strategy. Now, I will go out on a limb and say, I know that people that I like and respect have advocated for this. And so I'm not going to be a snarky jerk. However, I am not on team fat loading from a bodybuilding perspective during peak week. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about carb loading, it's pretty simple. We want muscles to get bigger and we don't want anything else to get full of stuff, right? So what we're trying to do is load up the muscles with things that will actually expand their volume. And it's very, very easy to make the case that loading up a muscle with glycogen, being adequately hydrated, easy, staying on your creatine, also easy in theory. But when people talk to me about fat loading, the question I always come back to and the question I haven't gotten a really good answer for yet is how much are we expanding the volume of a muscle by, even if we put everything else aside and say, okay, we're going to increase fat and we, for some reason, have good reason to believe that's going straight to the muscle, to the intramuscular triglyceride storage depots. I just don't see where all this volume is coming from in a way that's going to meaningfully change how your physique looks. Helms, anything that I'm missing?
Yes, and I think and it's a relatively nuanced application of it, but I will first say that I agree with you. Not only are there a non-osmotic storage capacity of intramuscular triglyceride in muscle, unlike carbohydrate, which is bound to water, and the more hydrated you are, you can actually have even higher intramuscular water storage than the typical 3-to-1 ratio people talk about, sometimes as high as like 10-to-1
Whoa.
in some studies.
Yeah.
But there is a really important thing to understand, that eating calories in general preserves muscle glycogen.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that's important to understand, because one thing that you will see is that this perpetual flatness occurs even on decent carbohydrate sized diets, proportion diets, when a deficit or even maintenance has been imposed upon someone who is very, very lean. They're always teetering on the verge of flatness, if not maintaining it, because there is this drive to preferentially put on body fat, which also speaks to what you're talking about. The leaner and leaner you get, your body will want to get to a higher level of body fat, because it's not liking the fact that you're at 6% or 13% body fat for a woman. So you have to kind of think about the relative cost, but also the time course and the magnitude of what's going on. So for people who struggle with what appears to be water retention with carb loading, or who have been on very, very low carb diets and don't seem to be able to either handle the GI discomfort of reintroducing carbohydrate, or it could be even psychological stress, but for whatever reason, they don't respond well when you carb load them, or it seems to be unpredictable or creates kind of a watery look. I have found that increasing calories and keeping carbs relatively low, I wouldn't call this fat loading per se, it does seem to result in a more reliable, if not quite as full look. And that is sometimes a reasonable compromise to get the best possible look. Another cool thing about muscle glycogen is it doesn't go anywhere unless you use it, unless you're really, really lean and in a deficit. So for people with the same issue, sometimes just giving them a load earlier in the week, letting them deal with the spill and the oddness that you might see around that, and then just bringing up their overall calories to maintenance without actually carb loading, it cleans up and they can kind of maintain that look. And I think the way to look at this is that being in a very slight surplus, even if it's from fat and even if it's likely to get stored as subcutaneous fat, the amount of actual fat storage you need to visibly see it, when we're talking about being in the order of grams being stored on a day-to-day basis, you have a time window where it just won't matter visually. So I have the same issues you do when people talk about fat loading. For one, the volume increasing size to muscle is minuscule at best. Two, we have no way to preferentially decide whether fat is going to get stored as intramuscular triglyceride or subcutaneous fat or somewhere else. While we do have mechanisms to ensure that, at least initially, most of the carbohydrate you take in is going to get stored as glycogen before you're tipping over and starting to see de novo lipogenesis pick up. So if you go on a low-fat, high-carb diet, at least initially, you know that you're not going to see much in the way of fat storage. So I think the rationale of increasing protein and increasing fat to get your calories higher while keeping carbs relatively restricted, and someone who just doesn't respond well, either acutely or chronically, as you've seen, or it's unpredictable or creates this kind of watery look, is a useful strategy. But I would fight back against the narrative that the explanation of as to why is that occurring is because of the magic effects of fat loading. I would also say, last thing, is that when people try to take a combined approach and they want to do fat loading on one day, carb loading on another day, they should take a look at some of the enzymatic changes in muscle and the competing ability of the body to switch between these substrates and use them, because they do impact one another. And I would suspect that your body is not going to be great at just being able to switch between preferentially storing intramuscular triglycerides exclusively without body fat, and then carbs exclusively without running into some issues. If you look at some of the research by like John Hawley and colleagues and those guys.
Yeah, so I totally agree with those nuances you point out, and I think you could probably get on board with me in saying that all sounds fine, but doesn't really fit the bill of what I would call fat loading. You know what I mean? Like the term loading is a loaded term.
It is. The only time I've actually seen what I would describe as fat loading be successful is in someone who has been a ketogenic, purposeful dieting bodybuilder for years, and they did fat load, and they do look fuller. And I think it has much more to do with the fact that that maintains their muscle glycogen stores as high as they can be.
Right.
And because they are ramped up as much as possible with using fat for energy, any amount of subcutaneous fat storage was negligible, and they did get fuller. Yeah. So, there's actually, a few people who will observe that. If you are someone who competes in bodybuilding and has been on a strict ketogenic diet under 50 grams of carbs for years, does that off-season and in-season, then you will notice that a calorie increase, despite carbs staying below 50 grams, will reliably result in a fuller look.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, Helms, quick question from the live chat. We got Marcus in the live chat here. The question was, best strategy to fix your re-bracing in the deadlift. So, for example, if you can keep your initial breath, keep yourself braced for the first couple reps, maybe 2 or 3 reps, your form's looking good, but then we're all human. We have to breathe, and you lose that tightness. And so Marcus seems to experience a scenario in which the initial bracing, he can't really seem to recapture it in subsequent repetitions. Now, Helms, for me personally, I very deliberately reset between every deadlift repetition. That's an old thing that carried forward from my powerlifting days. And even if I'm not powerlifting, the way I teach it in the class that I teach at Duke, I say, hey, it's not a race here. We'll put the bar down. We'll shake it out a little bit, reset, take a nice big breath. So I'm doing a full, like for me to do 3 repetitions on a deadlift is probably going to take me 9 seconds. So I'm very deliberately rebracing. And I find that in subsequent repetitions, because I'm not rushing it, I'm getting the same high quality bracing I did initially. What's your experience?
That's a big cosign from me, Trex. This is one of those things where if you have a tight belt, especially if you're tall, especially if you're a bigger person, um, not holding your breath the whole time, if you're going to do continuous reps, is going to be a challenge to maintain that same brace position. The good news, if you're doing this for strength purposes and you're interested in increasing your deadlift 1RM, is that a deadlift 1RM is always a concentric first movement. So there is maybe an ego hit because you can't say, oh, I did 90% of my max for 5 reps and getting the stretch reflex benefit, which often makes the second rep feel easier than the first. If people notice, especially if you're bouncing. Um, Take the ego hit, but improve the quality of your practice, and you can take it a step further and literally release the bar, stand back up, reset up, practice a 1RM or a single rep setup on each single rep. And that is something that Matt Gary, coach of all coaches in powerlifting, who we have actually interviewed for Mass, which is a pretty cool one, he advocates. So all of the athletes who Matt Gary and Susie Hartwood Gary coach personally, they only do singles on deadlifts. And if you want to do 3x5, it's actually a cluster of 15 singles where you reset up and brace on each one. It gives you a lot of very specific practice. Now, if you're doing deadlifts for general strength and size, you can, figure out how many reps you feel comfortable holding your breath on. Maybe that's 2 to 3. Then do that. So instead of doing a set of 6, you're doing 2 sets of 3 with no rest between. And you can just think of it like that.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right. Really good one in the chat here. So, Helms. Sorry, lost my place. All right. So, we've talked about previously, I know I have various places, a lot of different podcasts. It's not that unusual to talk to a bodybuilder, look through their diet, and you find out they're eating like 7 grams of sodium a day, like 7,000 milligrams. A lot of health recommendations cap you at like 2.5 grams, sometimes even lower, depend on who you talk to. So the question is here, given those health recommendations, wouldn't this be a completely extreme diet and warrant some intervention if you find that someone's eating 7 grams of sodium a day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you look at some of the more sports nutrition focused papers on sodium intake, they discuss that higher activity levels, especially in a hot environment, especially in someone who might be sweating, and in higher calorie intakes, that is kind of an exception to the rule. And while the data is there, if you look at large-scale epidemiological research and some intervention trials to make a case for lower sodium being on net slightly better for heart health or blood pressure, it's not like a huge effect by any means. And I suspect that even if there was a negative to being on a 5 to 7 gram, sodium diet, that if you're doing all the other things a drug-free bodybuilder would be doing, hopefully, if they have a good lifestyle, it would 100% come out in the wash as a neutral effect at worst. But yeah, there's a good paper that describes sodium intake in endurance athletes, which isn't a perfect parallel by any means, but talking about how intakes upwards of 5 grams should probably be seen as totally acceptable for athletes, and maybe higher, although we need more data.
Yeah.
So I think to some degree it's got to scale with calorie intake, which has got to scale with body size, which has got to also scale with activity. And then you think if that activity is making you sweat a lot, or even just breathe at an accelerated rate, because that is how we lose a lot of the moisture from our body as well, then there's really no way around that producing additional sodium losses. Although now that I say that, I don't know if you lose sodium through breathing.
Probably not. But
yeah.
But no, I mean, point taken in the sense that, those recommendations of kind of lowish sodium intakes, under, let's say 2.5 grams a day, I think, your overarching point, which I totally agree with, is that those should be scaled to something in theory. It shouldn't just be human beings across the board. That's exactly how much sodium they should be having. So like you said, I mean, a person who's, you know, I'm a college football fan. Of course, I'm going to work it in, but go turn on some football games in late August in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where it's 106 on the field and it's, humidity through the roof.
Feels like 130.
Yeah, you'll find every now and then they'll show a stadium where it's like, yeah, it's literally 130 down, like real field down on the field. Believe me, their trainers, their nutrition staff is saying, please, all the sodium you can get because you're losing infinite amounts of sodium through your sweating right now. So I think something that the only thing I want to add to that is it's very appealing to say we should all be on these low sodium diets because low sodium diets are the kind of first line of response when you are maybe drifting toward or exceeding the threshold for hypertension, right? So a lot of folks would say, well, therefore, you should be on a low sodium diet so that you don't get hypertension. It's important to recognize hypertension is multifactorial. It's also important to recognize that, yes, if you develop hypertension, there's a good chance your physician's going to say, one of the first things we do here is lower your sodium intake. But that's very different from saying that every person who has completely normal blood pressure needs to be capping their sodium intake. Because that ultimately, when people talk about the kind of health hazards of a high sodium diet, that's usually what they're hinting at, is this idea of blood pressure regulation and, potentially increasing your blood pressure. So I tend to find that for a lot of people, sodium's not a problem until it's a problem. If you start to notice like, hey, your blood pressure is high, even though you're meeting minimum requirements for physical activity, you're maintaining a healthy body weight, on and on and on, what do we do about this? Usually then you would start to say, okay, let's take a look at your sodium. So I'm not saying, hey, just because you lift weights, carte blanche, as much sodium as you like, but I try not to make it a problem till it's a problem. And sometimes it is a problem, but more often than not in the natural bodybuilding world, you don't really run into a tremendous number of natural bodybuilders when they're lean who have hypertension. They are out there for sure. And obviously it's worth intervening when blood pressure is high, but that's why you're seeing this discrepancy of like all these super fit, lean, healthy people who have normal blood pressure, but they're eating 7 grams of sodium a day. All right, Helms, really quick one. This is one I've not heard. Have you ever heard of creatine monohydrate increasing body odor?
No.
Neither have I. But I tell you what, I appreciate the spirit. It's always interesting to get these questions, and creatine is a magnet for them, right? Because everybody takes creatine for some period during their lifting career, and everyone is like pretty jazzed up for it, right? Like, hey, this is going to be an experience. I'm taking creatine now. And it's really interesting to see as people become more aware of things and start really keeping a closer eye on their body and how they feel and apparently how they smell. People start to notice more things and sometimes attribute it to creatine, even in instances where creatine is not really driving that effect necessarily. A great example, this is a slight offshoot, but like with supplementation, it's really important to understand expectancy effects. Because there was one dietary supplement I took in college that now that I'm older and I can look back at the ingredient label, this was useless. I essentially bought placebo pills, a trash product. I swore that it worked super well. And the reason was because it was kind of expensive for a dietary supplement on a college kid budget. I was like, well, since I'm on the supplement, I need to do everything right. So I was doing a better job with my nutrition. I was training harder. It was like putting myself in this like ramped up state of like everything has to be perfect so that we really exploit the use of this dietary supplement. And so I was like, oh my God, this thing's incredible. But it turns out, what's really incredible, Helms? Being great with your diet and training like a maniac. It turns out that's pretty good too. All right.
Can I make a small comment on the placebo effect, which is really interesting?
Yeah, sure.
This I think people will find fascinating. When you look at placebo-controlled double-blind research, the control groups, especially when they're testing the safety, and the side effects of a supplement. The control groups almost always have fewer reported side effects than the placebo group.
Yeah.
So this really does speak to the expectancy effect and the power of the human mind to create associations, correct and otherwise.
Yeah.
If you change something and you were aware of it and you think it could be or actually is, depending upon what they told you as the placebo group, on a compound that is modifying your physiology, you will also notice things that may be different on a day-to-day basis that are completely unrelated to it and be more likely to associate that with that.
Yeah.
So exactly to the point, there may be some other reason that your body odor has changed recently. However, you also recently started taking creatine.
Yeah.
So it's the type of thing that is incredibly common. And that's why we need control groups and placebo groups when we look at the effects and side effects of drugs as well as supplements.
All right, Helms, we got some questions about booze. Always a favorite
Cool.
topic of mine. My drink of choice is always a nice piney IPA. Should taste exactly like a pine tree with a little bit of citrus hint to it. Of course, I also love a good bourbon, being a good red-blooded American from the Southeast. From the Midwest. Now I'm in the Southeast. But anyway, the question is, if a client is open to improving their nutrition and exercise habits, but insists on consuming 2 to 3 straight vodka drinks every night, what in-depth guidance would you offer to help them continue making progress and optimizing results for muscle growth and overall health, given their alcohol consumption? So, 2 to 3 is an interesting number there, because depending on their body size and depending on whether 2 or 3 really means 2 to 3, honestly, my assessment, and when we say straight vodka, that is just pure vodka, no mixers, no extra carbohydrate in there. Honestly, there is literature to suggest that if there's a study that said, hey, we're going to give males in this study, randomized controlled trial, 2 drinks a night. Females are going to get 1 drink a night, just because that's how the guidelines usually shake out. And the effect of 2 extra drinks a night, which in one of the studies was beer, the effects on fitness-related outcomes over an 8-ish, 12-ish week trial was nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. And I would expect straight vodka to have even less of an effect than nothing at all on those fitness-related parameters. So I'm actually very, very confident that a person could get pretty jacked having possibly 3 and certainly 2 vodka drinks a night. Like I'm very, very confident that you're not going to be, frankly, at an intake level that is going to dramatically blunt your hypertrophy. The calories, you can make that up, no problem. It's just 2 or 3 shots of vodka. So from a fitness perspective, the reality is this is probably, depending on your body size. I mean, if you're the kind of person who's really tiny and you have to eat 1,300 calories to meet your fitness goal, then that's a different story altogether. But for a lot of people, 2 or 3 vodka drinks a night is not actually going to have a big impact on their fitness related goals in a vacuum. Now for health, this is not ideal. This is not recommended. There's going to be potentially some negative effects on brain health as you age if you extend this out over decades and decades. Potentially issues with liver health, obviously. And so what I would do for this person is I would perhaps provide some of that education about their brain health and liver health to the extent that you feel comfortable doing that within scope of practice and things of that nature. And I would say, I mean, frankly, for their fitness, I don't think it's going to make that big of a deal. But in terms of things you could encourage to facilitate, their health along the way, doing basic things that are good for brain health, just a nice health compatible diet, some nice omega-3s, preferably from a marine source. Thinking of the liver, maybe try to avoid really high intakes of added sugar, saturated fat, and especially if they're in a caloric surplus. In those types of scenarios, if you're throwing at your liver every day, a caloric surplus plus a bunch of saturated fat, plus a bunch of added sugar, plus 3 shots of vodka, that's actually materially going to be a negative thing for their liver health. So that's kind of the approach I would take is if they're dead set on it, educate where you can, mitigate some of those effects when it comes to, brain health, liver health. But honestly, for their fitness related outcomes, I don't really expect to see much of an impact here. Helms, anything to add to that?
No, I think you killed it. Each
Yeah,
shot of vodka is
I've
roughly like
I've
100 calories. So
I've actually heard of folks who have, like even more calorically challenging things to get. I've heard of folks who they're like, yeah, my client just insists I'm going to drink a bottle of wine every night, which calorically is a lot more to deal with than 2 or 3 shots of vodka, and that's where things start to get really tricky. And there's some serious health ramifications there. A bottle of wine a night. How many drinks are in a bottle of wine, Helms? Is that like
you're asking.
4-ish?
That's a question for Google.
Yeah, well, you
But
Google that because I'm going to answer another alcohol question here, if you don't mind. So we also got a question about can we get a full and detailed explanation of alcohol consumption does from an energy balance perspective when consumed? Can we actually use the calories in alcohol as energy, or is it like non-digestible stuff like fibers and sugar alcohols and stuff like that where we have to kind of turn it into something else without consuming the energy? And the carbs in drinks are those. What's the deal with those as well? Now, Helms, you gave me a hand gesture here indicating 5 glasses of wine in a bottle.
5 standard drinks.
This
in
is
a
why we need
750
Lauren
ml,
around here.
bottle.
Lauren has a wine certification. She would have knocked that out of the park
That's
instantly.
true.
But yeah, so yeah, if you're talking about 5 glasses of wine a night, that's going to be tough. But anyway, this question, the reason I wanted to address this one is because there is an interesting thing about alcohol metabolism. So when you're drinking alcohol at a rate that you're able to essentially metabolize it as it comes in, then alcohol, we are using those calories. And we actually really like to use them up fairly quickly. So they really do kind of jump up near the head of the line in terms of what substrates are going to be utilized for energy. So all that is to say, every bit of those alcohol calories count. And same thing goes for the sugar that might be coming with those alcoholic drinks. So unfortunately with alcohol, it's not like fiber where you're like, well, I'm only going to burn like a quarter of this really when we crunch the numbers. That's not really the case. We're going to burn those calories, use them for energy. And since we're using the alcohol for energy, we're not going to be breaking down maybe body fat that we would have tapped into otherwise. So it's definitely going to have an impact on energy balance. However, one exception, Helms, speaking of people smelling different, if you, not recommending it, if you drink at a rate that exceeds your ability to metabolize alcohol, let's say you're going pretty hard and you happen to get pretty drunk, the next morning or even that night, someone might say, brother, you reek of alcohol. I smell it literally emanating from you. That is actually a real thing. So if you outdrink your capacity for alcohol metabolism that rapidly, your body will actually excrete unmetabolized alcohol, ethanol, and you actually won't use those calories. They're literally leaking out of your body. And so those calories actually do not count from a technical perspective. You are not using that energy. It is literally leaving you with all the calories it came in with.
Florida man, cholesterol hands, vodka sweat.
Exactly.
Right.
So that is a real thing. But honestly, if you get to that point, then we're in pretty bad shape in terms of like counting calories. So like your workout tomorrow is going to be rough. You brought in a lot of calories through alcohol, but by the time you got to that point, so that is not an encouragement to say, hey, make sure you go big so you get some free calories. Definitely not the case, but it is an interesting little quirk of human physiology that I've always found really interesting. Helms, anything to add on the alcohol front? You've been abstaining, which seems symbolic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't drink a lot, to be honest. So yeah, I think you covered that really well. A lot of the guidance I'd be is exactly the same. I'm assuming you're in the mass YouTube. I'm in the Iron Culture. If you want to take some questions from there.
Sure. Yeah. What do you got?
Okay. Question to Trex. Do you find that meditation acutely or chronically makes you a little too relaxed to lift heavy? Do we need the free pre-workout called self-hatred?
No, I think actually there's some evidence to indicate quite the opposite. in certain scenarios. So what I think Mike has done most of the writing. Mike Zordos has written about this a few times in mass, but the idea that mental fatigue that you carry into the gym can, to some extent, have a slight impairment on your performance in the gym. And so the question is, especially for people who maybe you work out after a work day or after a full day of classes or after you're busy in the lab, you probably have been doing mentally demanding, if not tedious, tasks all day, and you probably are carrying some mental fatigue into the gym. And so a very fair question is, well, then what do you do? Do you just say, screw it, I'll try again tomorrow? And that's fortunately not your only option. A lot of times relaxation techniques are used in the literature to try to essentially alleviate some of that mental fatigue before doing an exercise bout. And so I think meditation definitely falls into that category of nice little relaxation exercises to kind of shed some of that, mental fatigue that you're bringing into the gym from whatever you were just doing. And I think a nice little, 5 or 10 minutes of quiet, whether it's meditating or just good old fashioned quiet time. I've actually done that before where I work out at a gym that has like a yoga studio, which is really lovely. They keep it like dark and quiet and stuff. And so I've gone in there with a yoga mat and just laid on my back for like 10 minutes and just shut my eyes and just relax. So, at the end of the day, being able to get into the gym after that and, hit the weights hard is going to be about whether or not you got that dog in you. I mean, like that's the intrinsic motivation to complete the workout and kind of bring your mental energy to it. But I think, if anything, a little bit of pre-workout relaxation, if you are mentally fatigued, would actually be helpful rather than harmful.
I think that makes total sense. I think the way to view it for Penguin, who asked the question, is that mindfulness practice is helping you kind of let go of all the things that might have clouded your mind and be stuck in your brain, for lack of a better word, when you're training, so that you can have clarity of purpose when you're in the gym itself. Not that you're about to do a 3RM squat and you go, you know what? Let me right now meditate before I tighten my belt.
Yeah. And a lot of people, they do mindfulness exercises or meditation for mental clarity. Or that's a huge thing that they notice. So that's what you really want to bring into the gym is mental clarity. And if you are going to get really hyped up or amped up for a specific set, you don't really want to start that 15 minutes ahead of time, right? You want to turn that on really quick and turn it off really quick.
Yep. And I can do a few other rapid fire ones.
Yeah.
Does 3DMJ coach a powerlifter who's going to Worlds this year, and what is Eric looking forward to the most at World and World Games? Unfortunately, at the current moment, I do not have any powerlifters I am working with who are competing at the world level. There are some athletes who 3DMJ as a whole is doing the nutrition for, who are competing at the highest level, but I don't think that we'll be necessarily being there. And there are some groups that I consult with and some athletes, so it's possible that I might be at upcoming Worlds or Worlds in the future, but it doesn't look like it, at least this year, maybe next year. But no, I'm really excited for the first time that unequipped powerlifting is going to be at the World Games. And to qualify for it, you had to podium at Worlds. So there's so many battles, honestly, that are coming up in both IPF Worlds as well as World Games, and so many incredible talents. I really want to see Joe Borenstein compete in 83s. I can't wait to see Agata Sitko compete and just to see what she can do and just extend these limits that we thought were unsurpassable. If you don't know, Trex, at Powerlifting America Nationals, Joe Borenstein, who's an 83 kilo junior lifter who competes in the Open, totaled 900 kilos at 83 raw. It's insane.
Yeah, and junior, is that under the age of 23?
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, that's crazy.
But he was in the Open. So, and Agata Sitko is approaching the mid 600s in the 69 and 76 kilo weight class, where she kind of has been sitting around bouncing between. And just pretty much the only lifter in all of the IPF right now who is 4 standard deviations above the mean in terms of her performance relative to the field.
This is why insane. I froze my personal powerlifting record books in 2012.
it makes us both feel better about our own accomplishments. So
Yeah.
I'm right there with
I
you.
printed them out so that the internet won't forget. So I've got my binders and I'm going to keep them for all eternity.
From Powerlifting Watch too, the
Yes.
precursor to open powerlifting.
Yeah.
Another good one, I think you'll probably totally agree with me on this one. Eduardo had two questions, which are basically a combination of is it healthy food or diet quality or calorie intake that drives someone to be overweight? And an example of someone who they see eat nuts but is overweight, but someone else who manages to eat junk food during their work breaks, but has a healthy body weight. And the cool thing for you, Eduardo, is that we've actually had some really interesting head-to-head comparisons over the years, and all of the metabolic ward when we can watch, control the diet, measure body composition change, comparisons between any type of diet that is controlled for calories, be it low carb, high carb, different compositions. That seems to be the primary factor dictating body weight change when we control everything. But out in the wild, when your diet interacts with behavior and activity, hyperpalatable foods that are energy dense, easy to consume, they have faster chewing rates, and what are typically described as ultra processed, although the processing is not necessarily the same as some of those ingredients, because some processed foods are actually great for you, like, say, a Greek yogurt as an example, or canned tuna as an example. The general issue with ultra processed foods, which have also been looked at in metabolic wards, but specifically with an ad libitum model, meaning you can eat as much as you want, is that people just eat more of them. So when you give people the same allotment of food from minimally processed or ultra processed, and this has been replicated now in Japan and the US, the same thing happens is that people just eat a lot more of the ultra processed food to get to the same level of satiety. And this is compounded in the real world by the fact that we are getting more and more sedentary. We don't need to move as much. And when someone is sedentary, it dysregulates their appetite. So they're more likely to reach a higher body weight as a stable baseline than someone who is more active. So if you take a highly active person who is eating some processed food in an otherwise unprocessed diet, it'll behave very differently than a inactive person who is eating a largely ultra processed diet, even if they're quote unquote trying to be careful because they're fighting so many body signals to try to prevent being in a calorie surplus. So it is not the question of either diet quality or energy surplus. It's that the reality is that a quote unquote low quality diet or a diet that is largely populated by unprocessed foods results in a calorie surplus much more easily, which is unfortunate, but it is the reality we live in.
But it is fascinating. I've been around a lot of folks, and it's been more on my mind since I had been taking a medication for a while that really ramped up my appetite. I've always had a big appetite, and it always blows my mind the people who you'll see that they're like, I'm going to drink a full sugar Coca-Cola and eat 7 pretzels. And they, even with these like super palatable, ultra processed foods, they're able to just kind of nibble at them and over the course of a day still eat like just without giving it much thought, like 1900 calories. And you're like, brother, if I open the floodgates for those types of food, like there's a lot of folks who are like, if I went anywhere near that stuff, before I looked up, I'd have had, 1,300 calories at this snack, So it is really interesting. I'm just forever intrigued by differences between individuals in terms of those appetite regulation signals. It's really fascinating stuff.
And is it the environment that they are habituated to, or genetics, or some combination? Almost certainly some combination, but I think uncovering those factors is really interesting.
Yeah.
Last 2 rapid fire, then I think we shut this sucker down. What do you say?
Yep, sounds good. We'll pull the plug.
All right. Very morbid. Scott asks, if I have the space and equipment, is there any benefit or negative to doing my exercises in a circuit rather than the traditional back-to-back or supersetting? I think the way to view circuit training is that it is a series of supersets. And they are probably a mixture of agonist supersets, agonist antagonist, and agonist peripheral. And if you want to get a complete guide to time-efficient training, we have that for free at massresearchreview.com. Myself and Dr. Zerdos wrote it, and it can tell you how you can use supersets and back-to-back sets, drop sets, and rest pause to be more time efficient without sacrificing things. So, Scott, the very high-level answer to your question is that if the two exercises don't quote unquote interfere with each other or train the same exact muscle groups, so long as you're not putting yourself in the cardiorespiratory hole, you can superset them. So you could do chest press with calf raise. You could do lat pull down with lateral raise. You could do squats with bench even. Just be aware that when you're doing large multi-joint compound movements, which train a lot of muscle all at once, you will definitely, even if they are not the same muscle groups, just be taking a bit of a cardiovascular hit. So you want to think about it. You'll figure this out by trial and error for a little bit, but just compare it to back-to-back sets. And if you have to lower the load more often or drop reps off, there's a little bit loss of efficiency, and you just need to rest a little bit longer or make a different pairing. But we've got a great guide for it, massresearchreview.com. Jump on there, click on our training guides, and we can give you a free time-efficient training guide, which I think will give you the outline of, with full programs and everything, how to do this.
And Helms, if I
Anything to add?
may interject, not everybody wants to be a muscled up freak like you. There's other training styles and other training
Go back to
focuses
front
and
page
goals.
fitness.
Well, no, but the reason I say this is I spent a pretty big, a decent chunk of my formative lifting years doing a lot of circuit training because I was a competitive wrestler. And that was my main training goal, was to be, prepared for wrestling matches. And the one thing I would say is, like, this was before CrossFit was big. And we ended up doing what I personally view as like a very meticulously planned version of that. Whereas like we were trying to develop all these different physiological systems in a time efficient way within reason. But the big key for that circuit training, if cardiorespiratory fitness is part of the goal for you, is you just want to make sure that you're building those circuits in a very sensible way and taking plenty of rest between rounds of the circuit. So we would start with movements that were highly technical, used large muscle groups, and we would kind of work our way down. And by the time you go down and down and down, you're getting to the exercises that you don't have to worry about technical execution. You don't have to worry about getting hurt if you do it slightly wrong. It's the kind of exercise you're more than comfortable doing in a fatigued state, but you can still do effectively, right? So maybe you start out with, one of your compound barbell lifts, and then you're doing some kind of push-up variation, and then you're doing some kind of lower body, lunge variation, and you're kind of working your way down the list, and then down at the end you're doing bicep curls or sit-ups or something like that. So you have to work your way down in terms of technicality, injury risk, and just kind of what are your most kind of key movements that you have to prioritize at the beginning. Give yourself plenty of rest and start it over so that you're getting back to those technical lifts in a rested state. So that'd be my 2 cents.
It's a great 2 cents. Probably more appropriate for a sister podcast, Front Page Fitness,
Right.
rather than Iron Culture. But I'm going to allow it because we're deep in at this stage.
It was a fun way to
And
train.
technically,
I got to be honest.
technically, wrestling does fall under the Iron Game umbrella.
Yeah.
Shout out to George Hackenschmidt. So I'll allow it this time, Trex.
Thank you.
All right. Last one. And it goes back to our discussion of creatine from Super Orchin. Have you reviewed or discussed the recent creatine study that found that creatine has no effect on increasing lean mass in conjunction with resistance training after the initial water loading phase? So I think there's a bit of telephone going on here. You probably mean the creatine loading phase, which does typically result in an osmotic effect of bringing more water into muscle. Even in studies where they don't do creatine loading, we do see increases in lean body mass. And probably more important than any single actual study would be a recent meta-analysis by Burke and colleagues that didn't look at lean body mass, but actually looked at direct measures of hypertrophy using MRI, ultrasound, or computed tomography, which did see that there was still increases in local muscle size. Granted, that could be, at least in part, two increases in muscle hydration. That would change muscle thickness, could increase muscle cross-sectional area. And of course, creatine studies are typically 8 to 12 weeks long, with some rare ones being as long as 6 months. And to your point, though, Super Urchin, is that Orchin, sorry. Didn't mean to butcher your name. I'm thinking that's maybe Scandinavian Super Orchin. Orchin, I think. I don't know. It's a screen name. It's a joke. I'll leave it. So the to your point though, it may be that creatine is more of a one-time investment rather than something that gives compounding interest. I think it can only help you though to have as high of muscle creatine stores as much of the time as you possibly can for your training and lifting related goals. And if that gives you this extra millimeter of muscle size everywhere that goes away if you stop taking creatine, I'm going to take my daily dose no matter what. And I have for 21 years. So, yeah, but no, I actually do think it is useful to frame creatine as something that you get a benefit from and then you maintain that benefit rather than something that increases your rate of progress perpetually. I don't think it is that good of an investment, unfortunately.
And how much would you panic if you missed one of those doses over 21 years?
Never happened, so I have no idea.
Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, actually what I do when I travel is I just take, like 7 grams instead of my typical 5 for the days leading up and when I get back. If I'm gone for longer than a week, then I will actually source some creatine while I'm there, because taking powder through security is just a pain in the ass.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little more on the like I'll like semi load before and after if it means something to me, but I also who are we kidding? I often just forget about it and I say I'll get back on it when I get home.
There was a version of Trex where that was true
Yeah.
at some point in time, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely. All right, Helms, is that it? We done?
That's it. Hey, lots of people saying thank you, and no, thank you for asking the question, because I guarantee you, if you had the question, dear listener, you weren't the only one.
Absolutely. Yeah. And creatine's just one of those things, there's a lot of modest upside and really not much of a downside to speak of. So I'm with you, man. It makes sense to throw it in there. While it's also good that people are, doing these studies to really rigorously challenge, some of our beliefs about exactly how large those effect sizes are. So props all around to question asker, researcher, and so on. All right. So Helms, thanks so much for joining me live tonight. It's been a while. It feels good to be back in the mix. Everyone in the chat, thanks so much for joining us on literally no notice. We didn't tell anyone we were doing this, but I assume you've been lying in wait on YouTube just on the off chance that we might, break out with a live session anytime. So thanks so much for joining us and participating in the show. If you want to support the show, a lot of ways to do it. You can like, rate, subscribe, review, share with a friend, join in the live chat, submit questions after hours in the portal. What's our website for that? It's massresearchreview.com/ironculture. That's what it is. That's where you can submit those questions after the fact. And if you really love the show and want to support us, of course, we're presented by the Mass Research Review. You can become a member today, and you can enjoy all those articles that we talked about when they come out on June 1st. So that's it for tonight. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great week, and we will see you very soon.